A slap on a quiet Los Angeles street would ignite a fire no one could contain when a cop's open hand struck Steven Seagal across the face, not knowing who he had just challenged, and in that frozen second, as phones rose and the crowd gasped, the storm was born, for this was never about one officer and one man. It was about power corruption, and the moment a guardian chose to stand his ground, what followed shook the city and rippled across the world as the Los Angeles sun sank, throwing long amber streaks across the cracked sidewalks of Jefferson Heights. Seagal stepped out of Corner Market, carrying a plain brown paper bag of Apple's water and a few protein bars, looking like any middle-aged man minding his own business. Yet his balanced walk and fluid awareness betrayed the decades of training that lived within him. Across the street, Sergeant Daniel Consincade sat in his cruiser, chewing gum like he wanted it dead, his reputation built, not on fairness, but intimidation. And when his eyes landed on Seagal, he shoved his door open without backup certain. He needed none. His bark carried across the street, accusing Seagal of theft, though his own partner, Ryan Coulter, had seen the payment, made Seagal remain calm, even showing the receipt. But Consincade pressed closer, needing control, until with one sudden crack his palm echoed off Seagal's face, and an apple rolled free into the gutter. The crowd stiffened as silence fell, and Seagal's jaw never moved, his eyes steady as he answered the sneer with quiet steel. No, but it does not belong to you either. The bystanders rippled with recognition, realizing who he was, and phones lifted higher as Consincade's rage swelled his hand, hovering at his holster. Seagal set his bag down, slowly gathering himself before the storm. When the sergeant lunged for his wrist, Seagal's body answered with years of discipline, one fluid pivot twisting Consincade's arm face first into the pavement. His gun, skidding beneath the cruiser, the crowd erupted, some in shock, some in awe, as chants rose. Let him go, let him go. The balance of power shifted in that instant, sealed when Lieutenant Marisol Vega arrived, cutting through the chaos with steady authority. Witnesses confirmed what cameras captured. Consincade had struck first, his body cam shut off by his own hand, while Seagal stood with nothing but groceries and restraint inside the station. Seagal's testimony unfolded as clean and measured as his movements, while outside the video soared toward virality. Vega promise, process, not outcome, but accountability began to take form, even as Consincade sat wounded in body and pride, muttering that storms fade, while Seagal walked forward, knowing some storms are not meant to pass quietly, but to remake the sky itself. Steven Seagal paused at Vega's words and replied that storms wash things clean before she guided him toward the side exit, where heat bled through the door and the narrow alley beyond seemed to hold its breath. She warned him that if threats came, he should bring them to her, and he promised he would. As they stepped into thin light, his phone buzzed with a call from an unlisted number. 3 words appeared on the screen: make the call. He slipped it back into his jacket and walked on as Jefferson opened before him like a stage after the curtain fell, with crowds still buzzing, arguing, filming, a teenager whispering that it was real, and the city itself leaning closer. He crossed the street back to the corner market, saw his reflection in the glass, an ordinary man in an ordinary jacket, and yet not ordinary at all. He bought another sack of apples and stood under a sky turning violet and ink before making the call. The message demanded, telling the voice on the other end that everything had changed, and moving down the block with the same quiet balance he had always carried, though now it seemed charged, as if the city itself was waiting for his next move. Night draped heavy over Jefferson Heights as Seagal walked with the apples tucked under his arm and the wave of his silent phone burning like a fuse in his pocket. The chant from earlier still echoed inside him, rare proof that crowds sometimes sided with truth over intimidation. But he knew those moments were fragile and short-lived. At the corner, a black sedan waited with headlights dim, its window lowering to reveal a pale man in a suit who called to him with the authority of a badge flashed to quickly to trust, claiming internal affairs and asking for an off-the-record meeting with the chief. Seagal saw through the stiff grip of the driver's hands, the bulge of a weapon beneath a jacket, and leaned close enough to catch his own reflection in the tinted glass before answering coldly that if their chief wanted words, he should ask properly, not like this. And he walked on, knowing eyes would remain on him at his loft. The stairwell smelled of dust and paint, and the lamp on his desk threw amber light against old walls. He set the apples down, picked up the landline, and dialed through layers of secure routes until Marcus Ortega, the weary chief of internal affairs, Answer Ortega, had once been a colleague and a skeptic, and now he admitted he had seen the footage and knew the storm Seagal had unleashed. Ortega urged him to come in that very night before the narrative could be twisted. Seagal countered that truth mattered more than control, but Ortega warned that without control, truth would be buried together. They sat in A government office humming with late night. Fluorescent fatigue, Ortega Gray and tired played the video frame by frame, showing Connoncade's spotless record on paper contrasted with the hidden pages of complaint silence, and Seal for Civilians had spoken out all erased. Ortega revealed it was more than corruption. It was Shield, a program thought dead, rebranded, and hidden, giving men like Connoncade wide latitude under the belief that fear was order. Alexis Monroe entered sharp-eyed and relentless, a civil rights attorney who had pursued Shield for years. She laid down folders thick with sealed cases, blurred photographs, and transcripts, each telling the same story: violent silence, dismissal of culture by design, not accident. Among the files, a young officer's photo froze. Seagal, Ethan Vance, a kid with a nervous smile, who had filed a complaint against Connoncade 3 years earlier, then withdrawn it, and vanished. Alexis believed he had been pushed into hiding, but if he lived, he could destroy. Shield. Seagal studied the photo as if it were a wanted poster, and said he would find him. Ortega cautioned him that it was no longer his job. Alexis warned that the hunt would make him a target before sunrise. But Seagal's voice carried steel as he gathered the folder and declared that it was his move. Now the city pressed in louder than before when he returned to his loft. The folder spread open across his desk, pages of abuse-sealed settlements and names of untouchable men, until Ethan Vance's face lay at the top. His phone buzzed again with no caller ID, and he answered without speaking. A low, muffled voice cut through the line, warning him that he was making noise and that if he did not walk away, he would regret what came next. The line clicked dead, and Seagal stared at the phone for a long moment before setting it down with deliberate calm, because he had heard threats his entire life, and this one was nothing new. What was new was a clarity it brought. They were afraid. He turned his gaze back to the photo of Ethan Vance the young officer's nervous smile frozen in time. Somewhere in the sprawl of the city, that young man was still alive, and somewhere he carried the truth, and Steven Seagal intended to find him. No matter who tried to stand in his way, the silence of the loft pressed down heavy, the air thick with unspoken tension. As Seagal leaned back in his chair, the way of the muffled threat still echoing inside him, the warning was proof that someone out there was still moving the pieces, still protecting the doctrine that had warped men into weapons. And for the first time in years, he felt the strike of something heavier than any blow he had taken. He rose, pacing the wooden floor, each step measured, not just with discipline but with burden, because he knew he had pulled a thread in a web that spread far beyond Connoncade, and those who built it would never let him tug again. Without resistance, the city's pulse bled into the wall, sirens fading into the distance, a bass line from a car stereo rattling the street, restless, as ever somewhere in that vast sprawl Ethan Vance was hiding, carrying scars no one had seen and truths no one wanted. Spoken. Seagal's phone buzzed again, this time with a secure channel. He recognized Alexis Monroe's voice, came sharp and focused. Steven, you are not going to like this. News stations are devouring the footage. Connoncade slap is everywhere. But the narrative is already splitting. Half call you a hero, half a dangerous vigilante. Seagal exhaled, slowly recognizing the tactic. Confuse the crowd, bury the truth beneath noise. Noise doesn't matter. If we have facts, he told her. Alexis pushed back, saying facts were thin whispers, patterns, fragments the crowd wanted. Proof of Shield, not just a viral video. Seagal's eyes fell on the photo of Ethan Vance. Then we need him, he said, and Alexis agreed, her papers shuffling, as she revealed a lead. Vance had rented an Echo Park apartment 5 years ago and vanished, but 2 years ago, under an alias, he checked into St. George Memorial for minor injuries, discharged the same night. Seagal asked which hospital. Alexis promised to send a record and warned him to be careful. These people did not bluff. Seagal replied that they had just warned him, and that was their mistake. Before stepping into the night, the streets were darker now, mist rolling from storm drains as he drove to St. George Memorial, where the night staff barely looked up. When he entered, hospitals in this part of town were used to strange visitors at stranger hours. He approached the desk, asking for patient records under the alias Alexis had uncovered, sliding the file across the counter. The receptionist hesitated, but a nurse nearby overheard and froze, recognition flashing in his eyes. You are talking about room 16, he said. The kid with bruised ribs and a stitched cut, who claimed he had fallen, but kept checking the doors as if someone was hunting him. Seagal pressed, where did he go after? And the nurse admitted that the boy had asked for directions to the bus station. That was all he knew. Was little, but it was enough. Seagal thanked him, and his boots echoed through the linoleum corridor before he stepped into the cool night. The bus station reeked of diesel and rain-soaked concrete, rows of flickering lights buzzing over cracked benches where forgotten huddled in coats too thin for the cold. Seagal scanned the terrain like a soldier, every detail registering. The broken camera tilted down with a scratched payphone, the homeless man hidden beneath yesterday's paper. He approached the ticket window and asked about 2 years back a name That could have been Vance. Maybe Vaughn, maybe Cash. The clerk laughed, saying they could barely keep the lights on, but rummaged through a dusty drawer, pulling out an old binder, a habit of writing down Cash ticket numbers, just in case, flipping pages. She finally tapped a scribbled line, Yvonne destination. Barstow Seagal's pulse sharpened. It was a false name, but close enough Ethan hadn't disappeared. He had run. And if he had gone to Barstow, that meant distance, but not too much, just far enough to hide, close enough to watch Seagal. Left the station, his breath steaming in the night. He dialed Ortega. The chief answered on the second ring. Tell me you've got something Barstow 2 years ago, a bus ticket, under a false name. There was silence on the line. Before Ortega spoke, Steven, don't chase us alone. If S.H.I.E.L.D.'s watching you, they'll know where you're headed. That's the point, Seagal. So let them know I'm moving. They'll make mistakes when they're nervous, or they'll bury you. They've tried worse. He ended the call and climbed back into his car. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon. Headlights painting tunnels into the dark. Each mile carried him closer to Barstow, closer to answers, and closer to men who wanted him silent. As he drove, his mind replayed the slap on the street, the crowds chant the threat on the phone. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people who had been silenced, the names buried under settlements and seal files Ethan Vance had tried to speak, and the advantage Seagal wasn't going to let that story repeat. Halfway through the drive, a pair of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. They trailed him too long, too steady. His instinct sharpened. He flicked off his headlights, letting the moonlight guide him as he veered onto a side road. The trailing car followed Seagal, slowed, pulling onto the gravel shoulder. The sedan stopped 30 yards. Back doors opened. 2 men stepped out, silhouettes hard against the low-beam glow. Steven Seagal. One called, his voice was steady, too steady. Walk away, this isn't your fight. Seagal stepped into the pale wash of the moon, his stance relaxed, but unyielding. You already made it my fight. The first man reached for his belt, the second circled wide. Seagal's eyes tracked both with the precision of a predator who had done this 1,000 times. I'm not going to tell you again, the man said, his hand tightening on the weapon. Seagal moved before the word finished. A wrist locked a gun, disarmed the crunch of gravel. As the second man lunged, Seagal pivoted, redirected momentum, and the second man slammed into the hood of his own car with a thud that rattled metal. Both dropped, groaning. Seagal stood above them, calm as stone. He leaned down just enough to let his words cut through the night. Tell whoever sent you fear doesn't own these roads anymore. He tossed the gun into the dirt, returned his car, and drove on the desert stretched ahead, cold and endless. But his path was clear. Ethan Vance was out there, and the truth was waiting to be found. The highway unspooled ahead like a black ribbon to Mojave. Night pressing close to the glass, Steven Seagal drove with the steady patience of someone who understood distance as a tactic, not an inconvenience. Gravel still clung to his tires from a roadside encounter, and the desert air carried metallic chill that slipped through the vents. He replayed every move, every word, not out of second-guessing, but to map the pattern of a mind hunting him. They had warned him, then they tried to block the road. They were afraid, and fear made people clumsy. Barstow announced itself with sodium lamps and a low hum of truck engines idling at the edge of town. The bus depot squatted behind a chain-link fence, its faded timetable rattling the breeze like a tired flag. He parked at the far corner and watched for a full minute patterns of movement, routines of the night. Who looked too awake for the hour? When he stepped inside, the air smelled of stale coffee, and cold diesel. The same clerk from his earlier call scratched in a ledger with a chewed pen. You again, she said, not surprised, just resigned. Bus, the end of the world leaves at 6. Everything else is late. I'm looking for a man who